Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 7. For this presentation, I'm going to stray a little bit from the topics that your module is covering, and because ultimately the module does a really good job of covering the basics of that. But one of the things in this course that I want to focus on a little more that I don't think is covered as well in the upcoming modules is the role of the police. And so this is ultimately an important topic. It really covers all of the performance objectives of the class. And so ultimately, I want to spend some time talking about the two roles of police that police have in working with juveniles. And those two roles that fall under the topics of control and prevention. And so I'm going to go ahead and click to the next slide, and we'll talk about each of those. But before we do that, just a couple general comments about juveniles and the police. We ultimately know that for the most part, the first point of contact with a juvenile is going to be first point of contact in the juvenile justice system with a juvenile is going to be through the police. And we know that initial contact is the most important. How the police officer handles that interaction ultimately can impact that juvenile for the rest of their life and their involvement in the juvenile justice system. Because of that, we give police tremendous discretion in how to handle that interaction. By giving that level of discretion creates a lot of responsibility for that police officer. Now, ultimately, one of the concepts we have in juvenile interactions with police is called what we like to call street corner justice. This is where a police officer can take care of the situation on the spot, whether it be sending them home, calling their parents. I can tell you that that's one, as my husband is a police officer, and a lot of times when he's dealing with a juvenile, the first thing he's going to do is call the juvenile's parents and say, hey, here's who I am. Here's what I'm doing. Did you know your son or daughter was doing this? A lot of times parents say no, and my husband will say, you know what, I tell you what, I'm going to bring them home. Can you meet me there? And, when we can talk more. Sometimes that's all it takes, and that's an example of on-the-spot resolutions. Some jurisdictions have diversion programs that police can use. For example, some jurisdictions have truancy programs where if they find a juvenile who during school hours is not in school and out walking the street, rather than bringing them home where there's nobody there, they can bring them to the truancy center. And then they notify the parents, and the parents need to come to that truancy center to pick them up. And so depending on the jurisdiction, there might be resources available that police officers can use to take care of the situation on the spot. But also whenever we give them opportunities like that, there's also the potential for misuse. And so those are things that we really need to take into consideration when we're interacting with juveniles. Now, as I said before, we know that the police play two different roles. They need to try to control juveniles and juvenile crime, and they also need to prevent juvenile crime. And so let's first look at control. Basically, when we look at the role of police in controlling juvenile crime, we can really break it down into 3 parts. Now, the first part is very, very cut and dried. This is detection. We become aware of a juvenile issue. Now, a lot of times that awareness is through a call for service. CFS is call for service, a complaint by someone, or ultimately they witness it themselves. And so detection is pretty obvious, but ultimately that's the first role in controlling juvenile delinquency. The second part is investigation. And ultimately, in order to figure out if a crime was committed, we obviously need to interview the juvenile. And ultimately, that is really a balancing act. We know juveniles have rights and responsibilities, and ultimately here at this point they're not under arrest. We're just trying to figure out if a crime was committed. And so in many jurisdictions, we can't interview a juvenile without bringing them into custody. But we don't want to bring them into custody because we know once a juvenile is brought into custody, the effects can sometimes snowball. And so we want to try to keep them out of custody as much as possible, but we need to ask some questions. And because ultimately we might not have anything. And so, you know, we may not have any evidence of a crime. We know that something might not quite be right. And so if you can kind of see where I'm going with this, sometimes we're really stuck in that we have responsibilities because we know, again, that initial contact is so very important and can impact that juvenile for the rest of their life, yet we also need to figure out if a crime was committed. If through an investigation we do decide that a crime was committed, we still need probable cause. So for those of you that have policing in America, criminal law, criminal procedure, we talk about probable cause. And we know, of course, that's more likely than not. We need to be able to articulate what crime we believe was committed. And so that's what we need in order to arrest that juvenile. But again, there's where we have to be careful is several states require the Miranda warnings, just like adults. Several states have that applied to juveniles as well. Some states don't have the Miranda requirements for juveniles, but they might require that you involve parents. But again, that's where it's really important that you understand how your jurisdiction does things, because not every jurisdiction requires parental presence in an interview. And so ultimately, we need to be able to demonstrate if we're going to interview a juvenile and they're going to be willing to talk to us, so basically waive their Miranda rights, we still need to show that it's voluntary and that they are capable of doing it, that they are competent. And so even if a jurisdiction doesn't require it, most will say best practice is to involve the parents early, because the last thing we want is that interview to be thrown out because the judge decides that it was not voluntary and they were not competent of waiving that right on their own. So that's why most jurisdictions are going to involve that parent early. As far as I talked about a little bit earlier, we know that police have tremendous discretion on how to handle a juvenile issue. And again, there's great variation from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. For those of you that want to be police officers, your department is going to have a policy and procedure in dealing with juveniles. But some general guidelines is that before you formally file a complaint against a juvenile, exhaust all your options, because again, we want the least restrictive available. We are not locking up juveniles on, whenever something happens. If the jurisdiction has options, we want to try to use them if possible. Kind of a no-brainer, yet we see it happening all the time, avoiding bias, race and gender. I talked about a couple weeks ago how when talking about girls, it used to be that police were not willing to arrest girls. We see that changing. We still see race being disproportionately represented in the juvenile justice system. A lot of times it's going to involve a quick character discernment. Is the child a con? Are they just telling you a story? Or are they trying to run away from something? Oftentimes we might see them, if they're not at home or won't go home, are they running away from something at home? And ultimately, if, again, as I said, if there are diversion options available, use them. Lots of communities have resources. Some have community-based restorative justice programs that allow, restitution, recidivism, or reducing recidivism through restorative justice programs. And again, this all varies on jurisdiction. A lot of times the correlation there, the larger jurisdictions have more resources for youth. I grew up in a very, very small town. We didn't have any of this. But if it's available, it's important that officers use it. When we decide to arrest, our discretion is often based on several factors. The first is the demeanor. Is the youth hostile or are they cooperative? We see that even with adults. The demeanor plays a role. How you treat the officer, how you talk to the officer plays a role. The seriousness of the offense is kind of a no-brainer. Yeah, are we talking a felony or a petty misdemeanor? Obviously, that's going to influence what the police officer does. Group offenders. There basically is trouble in numbers. And as we talked about last week, sometimes is this a gang affiliation crime? Victim request. This one sometimes I struggle with, but if the victim is throwing a fit and demanding that, and is present and demanding that this juvenile be arrested, that might influence the police officer's decision. The one piece that should not come into play is gender and race, although we know it does. Males as well as minorities are still disproportionately represented in all aspects of the criminal justice system. Police interactions are no different. All right, shifting gears just a little bit and talking about the abused and neglected child. Now, all of you will be taking the class domestic violence, and so I don't want to talk a whole lot about this because it's been covered at length in domestic violence. But remember earlier this quarter I talked about the one-pot approach, and that's where the juvenile justice system deals with all four categories of juveniles. And abused and neglected children were one of those categories. Now, ultimately, police are going to oftentimes be the first contact with these abused and neglected children. And first and foremost, a police officer's primary responsibility is ensuring that child is safe. If they need, depending on the level of abuse or neglect, do they need immediate medical attention? If so, that's obviously the very first thing the officer needs to take care of. Identifying other victims, witnesses, suspects. Again, as I already said, the most dangerous place for a child to be is in their own home. And so that's the research that an officer is going to take into consideration. Securing any evidence, interviewing the victim. Now, Corner House is an agency specific to Minnesota. It began in Minnesota. However, it's used across the nation, and it is basically classified as forensic interviewing for police officers of abused and neglected children. I would really encourage you to take a look at their website, cornerhousemn.org. They have lots of short little videos that really discuss the process of this forensic interviewing, as well as its importance. It's important in court, it's important for the well-being of the child, and really has a restorative justice kind of feel to it, but it is absolutely fascinating in its execution. A lot of times this is for veteran police officers are going to go through this training, detectives who are going to be interviewing the victim, and that interview will be used as court evidence, are mainly who's going through Corner House training. In these situations, police officers still hold a lot of discretion depending on the level of abuse and the evidence present. Sometimes it might be to warn the parents, saying, you can't leave your six-year-old home alone. Even though you think that six-year-old is really, really mature, we don't agree. And sometimes it's educating parents on what's acceptable, what's not, or educating them about resources that are available in the community. Sometimes it's going to be diverting the case or transferring the case to social services where, the family might be in need of help, and that's where the problems are originating, and social service might be able to provide that help. And then lastly, protective custody. If they believe that child is in imminent danger, they're going to take that child into protective custody if that's what they believe the child needs. All right, shifting gears again, we know the police are also playing an active role in preventing juvenile crime. And when we look at delinquency, aggressive law enforcement doesn't necessarily always work. A lot of times people think, well, the more police we can put on a problem, the better or more likely we're going to be to resolve it. That's not always true. It sometimes works when the target, if we're looking at a specific neighborhood, sometimes aggressive law enforcement is effective. If we are looking at a specific crime type, let's say there's been a rash of car vandalism, car break-ins in a neighborhood, aggressive law enforcement, and they think it's kids, sometimes aggressive law enforcement for that type of crime is effective. However, when we're talking about gangs, aggressive law enforcement in targeting gangs is not effective. It's counterproductive. It actually makes things worse. And so obviously we can't just ignore it and not do anything about it, but we have to be really careful, and there's a fine line and there's a balancing act there that we really need to manage in the police role. As far as prevention goes, we see police carrying a much broader role in prevention as far as the schools go. Many schools now have an SRO, a school resource officer. Some jurisdictions call them liaison officers. It's basically an officer who their job is to be in the schools. They're a great prevention aspect, but they also are reactive. So if something happens in the school, the police are there, pretty quickly because they're stationed there and can respond. We also see police playing a really important role in leading the DARE program and the GREAT program. Now, of course, DARE is drug awareness and resistance education. It is an example of primary prevention in that DARE is for everyone. It doesn't matter if you're at risk or anything else. DARE is for all kids, whereas GREAT, which is gang resistance education, is secondary prevention. These are kids who have shown some level of risk. And so GREAT is not in all schools, but GREAT is in schools that have a higher incidence of gang membership. And so we see law enforcement being very, very active in those roles. We also see the concepts of community-oriented policing and problem-oriented policing being very active. Now, for those of you that haven't had policing in America, we spend a couple weeks talking about community-oriented policing and problem-oriented policing. We see those concepts applying to youth. Basically, community-oriented policing is a concept that says we need to partner with the community. It is not us versus them. Who knows better what's going on in a community than those that live there? And so that's really the underlying philosophy of community-oriented policing, and that doesn't exclude youth. We need to get them involved as well, because you want to know who are the kids committing those vehicle break-ins? Ask other kids. They most often know and are very, very willing to tell us. Problem-oriented policing is part of community-oriented policing, but ultimately problem-oriented policing focuses more on some of the underlying issues. For example, in a week, actually I think it was week 1, we talked about curfews. Now, ultimately, areas that don't have curfews and are having vehicle break-ins are really dealing with an underlying issue. If there's no requirement for children to be indoors, they're more likely to be committing crime. And so that's one of the reasons that curfews have come into play. So really problem-oriented policing is finding what are the underlying issues, what's the commonality and kind of the roots of what's going on. We've talked quite a bit about status offenses, and ultimately a lot of times the status offense, for example, truancy, not being in school, is reflective of an underlying issue. And so problem-oriented policing is really trying to get to the bottom of that issue, and also if we can get to that underlying issue and take care of that underlying issue, it's going to reduce the level of status offenses and delinquency. And in problem-oriented policing, we firmly believe that youth can be part of the solution. We need to involve all members of the community, and that includes youth. Alrighty, let's take a look at the assignments this week. So the reading this week is a journal article. Now that journal article is, I think, 90 pages. please take a look at my announcement, unless you want to read all 90 pages. In the announcement, I articulate which sections of that article are going to be most important and that you should focus on. The discussion forum this week has you pick a drug of choice. Basically, the DEA the Drug Enforcement Agency has a great website on drugs, and so you need to pick a drug, and your discussion forum should summarize the drug as well as its effects. Your response post needs to be to a student who chose a different drug than you. This week, for your project, you have an annotated bibliography due. Basically, and again, take a look at the announcements because I provided further explanation. I'll also be sending an email that describes this assignment in more detail, but the basics of it is you need 5 scholarly sources. Only scholarly research. It's a persuasive essay. You need to be defending your opinion with persuasive arguments, not out somewhere on Google, Wikipedia, those types of things. You need 5 scholarly sources from our library databases listed in APA format. Then you're going to have a summary paragraph, so basically 4 to 5 sentences right in there to summarize the article, and then another paragraph that provides your reflection on or your assessment of that article. Again, I'll be providing additional information via email on that. So that is all I have for you this week. If you have any questions, let me know. Have a great week.